here. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. Thrilled to have all of you here in this room. We do a trade councils program every February, late January, February, where we hear from the sitting trade councils from Ways and Means and Finance. And actually, the people in this panel have all been at that event. Neena is sitting in. We've been doing that event, actually. Angela Ellard and I joked we've done it for 19 years. Next year will be the 20th year that we've done that program. She's been on it every single year. This is the first time we've ever actually had a former trade councils panel, and I'm actually absolutely thrilled to have it. They're unshackled. At least that's what I'm hoping for. In the past, when they've spoken, it's always been, I'm speaking for my boss, I'm speaking off the record, the views are my own. I mean, it's just a million different caveats that they had to say. So hopefully we get none of that today, although I know folks have their different hats that they wear today, and they will be speaking in their own voice. So thank you all for being here. This is a super important conversation. There's more happening on trade right now than we've had in generations. We talked, I think some people said back since the 80s, and I can't remember who was the deputy USTR at the time. I'm trying to remember. You were a USTR at that time.
I worked for him.
You worked for him. So it's a very busy time. We're thrilled at WITA. We've had a lot of activities looking at the current trade conversation. We're going to be hosting an event on China. We're going to be actually doing 2 or 3 events on China and the discussion of a trade, whether it be a trade war or whatever that we want to call it, over the next few weeks. The next event we have is May 3rd, and this is sort of a background. What is happening in China? What is the political situation in China? What is the economic? Where are they going? What is causing the current tensions? Not what is happening with the trade dispute, but what is the cause of the current tensions? So that's an event what we're going to be doing on May 3rd. We'll be announcing other events. We're going to be doing another NAFTA event in May, another China event. So we have quite a few things on the calendar, but I'm thrilled to have this panel here today. They're all friends. Really delighted to do this. Paul DeLaney is our moderator today. He's also a WITA board member. We'll have the panelists will give presentations, discussion between them, and then we'll take questions, have time for questions from the audience. With that, Paul.
Well, welcome everyone. Really excited about our WITA panel today. We're going to hear from some of the leading thinkers on trade policy. We'll share their experiences and perspectives and insights from their service on the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, and how they might apply in today's trade agenda. So our topic is to explore the role of Congress in formulating U.S. trade policy. We're going to talk about how Congress has exerted its constitutional authority over tariffs and foreign commerce in the past, and think about some more recent past as well, and see how that impacts where we are today and where we may be going. Ken mentioned, I do want to stress that our guests here are here in their personal capacity today. We really do appreciate their time and wisdom that they're going to be sharing with us. You have their bios, but I did want to quickly introduce everyone. I don't have it in the right order, but we have Viji Rangaswami, for the Vice President, Federal Affairs Officer for Liberty Mutual, former Chief Trade Counsel on the Democratic side for House Ways and Means Committee. Ryan Pomper, partner at Akin Gump and the co-lead of the firm's public law and policy practice, also former Chief International Trade Counsel on the Democratic side for Senate Finance Committee, also teaches trade at GW, so we'll be learning from him today. Grant Aldonas, Executive Director of the Split Rock International, also formerly U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce for ITA in the Bush administration, and also Chief International Trade Counsel on the Republican side, and also a professor, so we have 2 with us. And then certainly, last but not least, we got Neena Shenai, the Principal of Global Trade Counsel at Medtronic and a visiting scholar at AEI, and formerly Trade Counsel on the Republican side. And then I also worked on the Finance Committee as International Trade Counsel as well. So today we've got 4 topics that we wanted to walk through. I'll briefly just highlight them. 1, the constitutional framework and evolution of congressional power and policymaking over tariffs and foreign commerce. The evolution and purpose of fast track and now TPA, and sort of a focus on how that plays today. Looking at congressional votes on trade agreements and the authority to withdraw from trade agreements implemented through an act of Congress. And then the statutory authority to enforce trade agreements and congressional oversight, whether 232, 301, IEPA, there's a whole range of action. I just want to give a couple very brief framing comments. The balance between Congress and the executive branch over tariffs, trade policy, and trade enforcement certainly has evolved and shifted over time. Right now, the Trump administration's trade policy agenda is moving on many fronts quickly and in concert, whether renegotiating NAFTA with potential threat of withdrawal, tackling steel and aluminum overcapacity through 232, challenging Chinese IPR and tech transfer through 301, looking at new investment potential restrictions. At the same time, Ambassador Lighthizer in his recent hearings was very clear that the administration wants to embark on an aggressive bilateral trade agreement negotiation agenda, and is also looking at our preference program. So pretty much the entire trade agenda is in play right now, and we're in the middle of the TPA extension, the 3-year extension request. So with all that movement on so many fronts, I'm sure there'll be new trade rumors while we're sitting here this morning that emerge, that all of us after this will try to figure out what they mean. A lot of what is being advanced today is relying on statutory authority that was designed decades ago. So it's being used in a manner and sort of in a trade context that was very different from when these bills were originally passed. So we'll get into that. And the impact of all these actions will hit every congressional district, every state. So Congress is hearing from their constituents about the trade agenda, and so that's what we're here to talk about today. Is what is Congress's role, and what could it be? Again, just thrilled with the panel we have here. It's interesting. Some were in the minority, some were in the majority. Some served with the president of the same party, some served with the president of the other party. So we've all seen kind of different permutations and been through different experiences that I think do lead a lot to where we are today. So the last thing I'll say is just to start and kick things off. We'll go back to the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So we're going to start. Each of our panelists is going to give a framing, couple of comments and thoughts, and then we'll just have a discussion and we'll work through it. So we'll start with Brian on the constitutional framework. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to WITA and Ken for the invitation here. It's really great to be on this panel with all these old friends and colleagues, and see many old friends and colleagues in the audience. So I appreciate the opportunity. It has fallen to me to talk a little bit about the history of how we came to be where we are in the trade framework and how negotiations are structured today. So as Paul mentioned, of course, our Constitution actually is a little unique in the world for a variety of reasons, but vesting the power over international commerce into the legislative branch is a pretty unique circumstance. Article 2, I think it's Section 3, gives to the President the power to negotiate treaties with foreign nations. So you have that kind of dichotomy. For the first 150 years of the United States, Congress really was the sole entity that exercised control of international trade through the tariff, setting the tariff. And I'm told, I haven't done this research myself, but I'm told if you go back and look at the volume of pages of congressional debate in those first 150 years, the debate over the tariff takes up the most volume of any single issue in the first 150 years of our existence. During that period, the executive branch basically negotiated treaties of amity and friendship, these sorts of things. They were not trade treaties as we think about them, or trade agreements as we think about them today. That, of course, ended famously, or led famously up to 1930, and just a little bit of history on the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff. In 1928, Herbert Hoover ran on a platform of helping farmers. The rest of the U.S. economy was doing quite well, but he wanted to help the farmers. And in order to do that, he wanted to put up some tariffs to help the farmers. But politics being what they are, then, frankly, as of now, once the ball got rolling, a lot of folks jumped on the bandwagon, and we ended up with this Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, where I think the average tariff went up to somewhere in the 60% range of all tariffs in the United States. And it had the effects that we are all well aware of, where world trade fell quite a bit. I think import volumes in the United States, well, exports fell to about a third of their prior volume. I think many economists believe it helped deepen the depression. And then the hero of our story, or my story, rides into the picture here. It's funny, I always, when I teach my students, I tell the story because none of them have ever heard of this politician who is previously a member of the House of Representatives from Tennessee and then a senator from Tennessee, who was FDR's Secretary of State, named Cordell Hull. Out of curiosity, how many people have heard of Cordell Hull? This is a pretty experienced audience. But still, if you look around, a lot of people still have never heard of Cordell Hull. So this guy, Cordell Hull, was a Southerner, and typically back then, Southerners tended to be more free trade, and the Northerners who were industrial were a little bit more protectionist, wanted to protect their growing industries. So he thought Smoot-Hawley was a disaster, and among many who weren't against it. When he became FDR's Secretary of State, of course, at that point, trade policy was vested in the Secretary of State Department. He had the idea that we needed to lower these tariff rates. And he had, I think, one of the most consequential ideas that does not get enough attention and credit. This idea of giving the president advance authority to cut tariffs, and trade at this point was really all about tariffs, by a particular percentage, 50%. We're going to in advance give the president, by proclamation authority, the power to cut tariffs by 50%. And as long as the president doesn't cut more than 50%, you don't have to bring it back to Congress. We give you advance authority to do so. That was the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. And the genius, I think, in part of what Cordell Hull conceived of here was this idea that he understood politically it was still going to be really difficult to say we should unilaterally lower our tariffs because it's good for us. He understood the way really to get at politically cutting tariffs was to do these negotiated agreements. And over time, through these painstaking agreements being negotiated under MFN, over time these tariffs were lowered. That brings us up through the Kennedy round. That's how trade policy was structured throughout those decades in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when trade policy was really about tariffs. You get to the Kennedy round, and all of a sudden, attention starts to turn towards non-tariff barriers. And it's a little bit harder. How do we do it? Can we give the president advanced proclamation authority? During the Kennedy round, the Johnson administration negotiated a couple non-tariff barrier agreements on customs valuation and one on anti-dumping. And the Congress warned the administration, don't negotiate these agreements. In fact, passed a resolution opposing, particularly anti-dumping agreement. And so Johnson ignored that, and when he brought it back, Congress refused to bring it into force, refused to enact it. Huge embarrassment for the administration. And that began a period of dormancy for what we would now call TPA, but this ability, this negotiating authority for the president to negotiate, where Congress and the president tried to figure out what kind of a structure we could have for negotiating agreements where we're talking not just about tariffs, but about broader regulatory issues. The Nixon administration, when it came in the early 70s, proposed to Congress, you know what, why don't you just give us advance authority to rewrite laws? Because that's what we're going to do. We're going to negotiate non-tariff barriers. Just we'll write the laws, and you can vote up or down in a legislative veto type thing when we bring back our law to you. But let us rewrite the law. And Congress, fortunately, said, you know what, Mr. President, that's not how we write law in the United States. Congress writes the law, and we can't really do that. So over the course of a while and negotiating with the administration and the legislative branch, we came up with this, I still say we. I haven't been on the Hill in 11 years. I still say we, so part of it. But the Congress and the executive branch came up with this structure whereby the legislative branch would grant the president, the executive branch, the authority to negotiate these trade agreements. They would set the contours of what kind of an agreement the legislature wanted the president to negotiate. Those are the principal negotiating objectives that we...
I was saying, maybe
yeah.
before we
yeah.
spill all the beans for the TPA fast track for Neena too.
Yeah. Okay, I was just getting up tonight to 74.
You got us right to 74, but I do want to see if folks, others do want to sort of just know on this sort of structural, how there was this shift over time.
Sure, I'm happy
you guys,
to let Neena take it.
No, and before we switch to Neena, are there any comments you guys want to talk about, just on sort of where, this sort of structural question really leading up to maybe 74 Trade Act, but maybe Grant or...
Just add a couple things to what Brian said, and the history is exactly right. I want to start one step earlier, which is how we ended up with Article 1, Section 8, which you tend to forget that we fought a revolution about taxes and trade. While it was ultimately about the distribution of power and about liberty, the proximate cause was a series of acts by Great Britain trying to restrict American trade. And particularly a series of stamp acts, which we're familiar with. That's why they dumped all the tea in the Boston Harbor and all those sorts of things. But when we were free, we had 13 separate tariff policies. And it was the problem created by the Articles of Confederation that led to the idea of the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. The really salient point there was what freedom didn't give us was a unified tariff policy because of the interests in New England relative to the South that Brian mentioned. The consequence of which they were very guarded in how they were going to delegate the power. And if you look at the Constitution, one of the fascinating things about it from all of us, and I'm sure like Jean-Francois from the outside, looking at the mystery that is Washington, D.C., one of the things about the Constitution is they lodged the power to alter all this in the body closest to the people. And it was largely because they were unwilling at the state level to concede too much authority, and they certainly weren't going to cede it to the monarch, right, to the executive. And so the whole framework is one that actually lends itself to this fairly strict constraint in terms of who actually, and it has implications for today, about who actually is in control of that power. Second thing is, everything that we do in this area, to Brian's good point, is about a single problem. It's the separation of powers. You have to start with a series of important constitutional law points, the first of which is that we cannot do anything by international agreement that violates the Constitution. Right? You can't violate individual rights, you can't infringe on individual liberty. Things that are constraints under the Constitution also bind the treaty power, as well as how we make other international agreements. And the point is that the separation of powers, the distribution of powers within the government, is just as sacred as the Bill of Rights in that context, because it's one of the elements of how we have our freedom. So the point is that the separation of powers has to play out even in the context of our relationships with other countries. We're not free of that. The president's not free of that when he steps abroad to negotiate. And everything we've done, and this was Cordell Hull's insight, was to find a way to equilibrate the very firm delegation of power under Article 1, and then for those of you who are familiar with the Constitution, the president's foreign affairs powers are knitted together from a series of relatively minor things in Article 2, plus the idea that the nation had to act within the framework of international law with its full sovereignty. But that implication doesn't empower the president to do anything relative to the structure, the separation of powers, that he couldn't do otherwise. So when you look at this, and you look at what we then do in 1974, and what we've done with Trade Promotion Authority ever since, and why you have things reflected in the architecture, the processes of the 74 Act, and every time we've continued to provide authority now, think about it in terms of its design to try and elide the problem that the separation of powers confronts both branches with. And that's why we still have the vitality of this division and why we need to shift back and forth. But ultimately, it's about the separation of powers. And we roll all the way through to the end of the conversation today, that element is going to come back into the conversation.
Did either of you want to chime in, or want to maybe switch over to Neena? And great, we'll now go to that fast-track TPA evolution. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Ken and WITA. Also, it's great to be here today. Thanks for having me here. So, picking up where Brian left off with this intriguing story. I think you've brought us to 1974. So, I think there was as Brian mentioned, there was this inherent distrust by Congress of the administration because the administration had gone farther than was than the authorities actually delegated to the president. And as Brian mentioned, there was a reluctance to provide that approval for what the president had done in the prior negotiating round. So what did the 74 Act do? So it acknowledged that there would be these other types of measures apart from tariffs that the president would negotiate, but under congressional authority. So it also acknowledged the perils of having there be a full congressional process following such a conclusion of an agreement that could say, prevent trading partners from closing out deals, as well as affect U.S. negotiating leverage with this type of a new authority. So what was created, as many of us know, is this expedited procedure for congressional review of trade agreements. So it was the agreement that if the president abided by negotiating objectives set out by Congress, that an agreement would get an up or down vote through an expedited procedure through Congress. We had limited debate, as well as with some consultation requirements, very specific consultation requirements with Congress. And since this 1974 Act was passed, all of the 14 U.S. FTAs in place, as well as the WTO agreements that have been passed since, have all been done through this process. So there were several of these sort of re-upping of these processes passed since '74. Of course, we know of, in '94 we've got NAFTA and the URAA that was passed. We have 2002, which extended all the way through for agreements that were negotiated through 2007, and then we have the 2015 TPA, which some of us up here had a chance to work on. So maybe just a quick word about what the 2015 TPA included to kick off our discussion here. So there are three main facets to TPA. So there are negotiating objectives, there's consultation requirements with Congress, and then the role of Congress in sort of controlling implementation bills. So the first piece, the negotiating objectives, are those, again, directives to the president from Congress on congressional priorities in the negotiation. And what was different in the 2015 bill is that these objectives were updated. So in addition to the trade in goods as well as agriculture, there were some new provisions added in to reflect really the new state of the U.S. economy. So new goods and services objectives for issues like digital trade, cross-border data flows, even in agriculture and intellectual property, as well as state-owned enterprises, promoting global value chains. And these negotiating objectives and the framework are supposed to be in place through 2021, and as Paul had mentioned, require the president this year, as he has just done, to seek a re-upping of this authority, subject to a disapproval resolution in Congress. On the consultation requirements, there are consultation requirements in the bill with Congress as well as the public. So there are requirements that the administration consult with Congress on access to text, publication requirements, transparency, and there was a new House and Senate advisory group created on negotiations with the relevant chairmen in both houses. And lastly, we had the congressional control of the implementing bill. So in addition to the expedited procedures for consideration of such legislation, there was also an additional resolution added into this TPA, which is this consultation and compliance resolution, which would essentially kill the expedited procedures if the House or the Senate didn't believe that the requirements of the agreement actually met the requirements of TPA. So maybe I'll stop there and open it up and see if anyone has anything else to add here.